I'm very grateful for that extremely flattering introduction, because I know I've come out of England, and out of England biographers are not well regarded. And we are well aware of this, not just in Germany, but anywhere in Europe. And so, oh gosh, sorry, I've got the wrong bit of papers here. We're always on the defensive. So John's very nice words about my work are very charming. And I thought I'd start by just saying a little bit about Dickens and Germany, because he's not very much associated with Germany. Everyone knows he loved France and went to France a lot. But I thought you might be amused. Of course, his work was translated from the Pickwick Papers on, and he was very grateful for that, and he had good friends in Germany. He sent two of his sons, actually, to study in Germany. His eldest adored son, Charlie, was sent to Leipzig to learn German and to study to become a businessman. And the very perceptive professor in Leipzig wrote to Dickens and said, your son is a clever and charming boy, but I don't think he's set to be a businessman. And Dickens was absolutely insistent that Charlie was to be a businessman and went on forcing him to be a businessman. And of course, Charlie turned out to be hopeless and was always becoming bankrupt. And Dickens was always bailing him out. And in fact, at the end of his life, Charlie was bankrupt. And Charlie's daughters, in 1911, after Charlie's death, had to turn to the nation and ask for a grant from the nation because they were so impoverished. People who think writers make a lot of money take note of that. Yes, something quite irrelevant really, but I've just found out that Theodore Fontana, was a neighbour of Dickens in Tavistock Square in 1852. It's a useless piece of information because they never met. But there was this great... I would like to say they had an interesting conversation, which I would like to be able to print, in which Dickens told Fontana all sorts of things he never told anybody else. But it is not so. But Fontana, of course, is a wonderful, wonderful writer. Now, just two more little things. At the very end of Dickens's life, he was visited by a young woman called Constance Cross, who wanted to become a writer. And she wrote to Dickens and said, could she come and see him? And he said, yes, come. He'd rented a house at Hyde Park Place in the centre of London. And in April 1870, so very close to Dickens' death, she came to see him to ask his advice. And she wrote an account of her conversation with him. Well, we know that we can't always believe these are a gospel truth. However, this is what she wrote. She said they talked of Goethe and Lessing, and he seemed pleased to find that I had not been attracted or influenced by Heine. Why? Anyhow, we know Dickens didn't care for Heine. Then he told her that he was contemplating a stay of 2 years in Germany, in order that he might acquire the language colloquially. Wise Dickens. He told me that he decided to go, accompanied by his daughter, to Thuringia, so I suppose Weimar and the beautiful countryside, and that he was much looking forward to the accomplishment of this plan. Well, his daughter Katie was married, and his daughter Mary, never said a word about this, so you wonder if the daughter... perhaps daughter was a euphemism in this case, and the young woman he was planning to go to Germany with was not a daughter. But isn't that absolutely extraordinary that Dickens, 2 months before he died, was thinking, or said, or for a moment he was thinking, that he would come here and live in Germany. And wouldn't that be wonderful? A wonderful imaginary story we could tell about Dickens in Germany. Perhaps Peter Ackroyd could write it. You know, it's absolutely up his street. Finally, my last little German point. John Forster, Dickens's great friend and great biographer, tells us in his chapter on Little Dorrit that when Bismarck was ready to open fire on Paris in September 1870, shortly after the death of Dickens, he met the French leader, Jules Favre, under the walls to negotiate what was going to happen. And the great German, Helmut von Moltke, the general, I think he was, or maybe field marshal, but anyhow, the great military leader who would be in charge of the campaign, and who was a brilliant linguist and a writer himself. As Bismarck and Favre debated and discussed what was to happen together, Von Moltke was sitting in the corner reading Little Dorrit. Isn't that amazing? So that is my very, very few little links. Now, I want to let you hear the voice of Dickens in a letter. So I'm going to read you a short letter. It's a letter he wrote in March 1844 to his elder married sister, giving a short account of what he'd been doing. He'd been in Liverpool and he'd been in Birmingham. And I'll explain to you later what he was doing there. But this is one of my favourite short letters of Dickens. Dickens was one of the great letter writers, and the 12 volumes of his letters tell you so much about England in the mid-19th century, and they also reveal Dickens as the great letter-writing performer. I mean, he performs his letters, and they are absolutely amazing. Of course, Dickens would have liked all those letters to have been destroyed. We always have to remember that. He would be horrified that there are 12 volumes of wonderfully edited of his letters, but we can be grateful. So, my dear Fanny, I left Liverpool at 10:30 on Wednesday morning and reached Birmingham at about 3:30. That was the new railway then, where I was received by some most excellent fellows and straightway conducted to the town hall, which positively took away my breath. Birmingham Town Hall was newly built. It was a Greek temple, a huge Greek temple. It's still there. It's not the town hall anymore. It's raised up very high. It's the most extraordinary and impressive building. Took Dickens' breath away. A committee of ladies had decorated that immense building with artificial flowers to such an extent that it looked like a vast garden. And on the front of the gallery, facing the platform, were the words, "Welcome, Dick." Now, Dickens used to call himself Dick at this time very often. In gigantic letters of the same material. There were also transparencies representing diverse fames in the act of crowning diverse Dicks. To the unspeakable admiration and delight of the Queen, her effigy was also up there, Queen Victoria, who looked on approvingly. Now he pauses and he begins to tell his sister what he'd been doing the night before in Liverpool. Having danced a Sir Roger de Coverley, that is a very vigorous country dance which goes on for hours in couples running up and down the room. A Sir Roger de Coverley of 40 couple until 3 o'clock in the morning, I was rendered rather nervous by these splendid preparations, especially as I was vexed to have nobody with me to see them. But I dined by myself at the inn, took a pint of champagne and a pint of sherry, dressed in the magpie waistcoat, and was as hard as iron and as cool as a cucumber again. At 10 minutes before 8, they fetched me. The hall was crammed to the roof with all the first-rate Tories, Whigs, and Radicals in the town, and ladies in full dress were standing for want of seats in all parts of the crowd. The moment Dick appeared, the whole assembly stood up, with a noise like the rustling of leaves in a wood, and then began to cheer in the most terrific manner I ever heard, beginning again and again and again. When they at last left off, Dick dashed on, and I must say that he delivered the best speech I ever heard him make. So, advice to writers, if you're nervous about getting up to speak, a pint of champagne and a pint of sherry, and you will be absolutely, absolutely safe. Well, a little bit of context for the letter, because it is a marvellous letter, and I've talked about him giving a performance. He does present himself as a character, doesn't he? We see, he's 32, we see his high spirits, we feel his high spirits. We know from this letter that he loved dancing, he would dance till 3 in the morning, that he liked a good drink, that he cared about his clothes. The magpie waistcoat, a famous waistcoat of his that was black and white, and he as soon as Dickens had enough money to buy fine clothes for himself, he bought fine clothes for himself. Although he is thought of, he is a Victorian novelist, he was very like a Regency dandy, Dickens. He loved to present himself as a very, and he wore his hair very long, he had beautiful glossy hair. Well, you can see it over there, that wonderful Macleay's picture of him. He looked very good. What else does that tell us? Well, I must explain to you this letter, 1844, it was the Hungry 40s. England was in a recession. People were unemployed, people were hungry, life was very hard and getting worse. And it was very like life in England now. It was worse than life in England now, but there are great similarities with life now. And what Dickens was doing in Liverpool and in Birmingham was this. He was speaking to raise money for what were called mechanics institutes or polytechnics. They were set up by benevolent people for working men and working women also to have access to libraries, to lectures, and to education, further education, not only in the arts but in the sciences and engineering. They were very, very important places. Dickens spent a lot of time travelling around helping to raise money in the industrial towns. And many of those mechanics institutes developed later after Dickens's death and became the great universities of Liverpool and Manchester and Birmingham and so on, Leeds. So it was a wonderful thing he was doing, and he maintained an interest, and he went on. When he began to do public readings, he would go and read in those towns, and he was loved. He was loved by the people of those towns because they knew he was on their side, and they also, of course, read him because he was absolutely accessible to all sorts of readers, and his books came out in monthly serials, paper covers, and they could afford to buy them and read them. So that's some of the reason why he was adored by the people of England. So the Hungry Forties. Well, one thing he'd just done when he went on those trips is he'd published A Christmas Carol. And, of course, A Christmas Carol is written for the Hungry Forties, and it's written for today. Scrooge is a city man, a rich city man, and at the beginning of the story, he is asked to contribute some money to help the unemployed, to help the poor. And he says, they're looked after, aren't they? I help to support the workhouses and the treadmills, the places where they can go when they can't manage anymore. And he refuses to give the money. As the story goes on, as you all know, Scrooge is softened by the experiences he has with the ghosts and the spirits he meets. And he's taken to look at his own past, and immediately he begins to change as a man. And when he's with the spirit of Christmas Present, who's a very jolly spirit, it's just coming to the end of the time with him, out of the spirit's cloak come two wolfish children, a boy and a girl, yellow, meagre, ragged, scowling wolfish, where angels might have sat, enthroned devils lurked. And Scrooge says to the spirit, "Are they yours? Are they your children?" And the spirit says, "They are man's. This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware them both, but most of all beware this boy, for on his brow I see that written which is doom." And he stretches his hand out to the city where the doom will arise. And Scrooge says, "Have they no refuge or resource?" And then Dickens, in one of his most wonderful rhetorical devices, makes the spirit say to Scrooge, his own words, "Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses?" And that's how that chapter ends. And it's it always makes my hair stand on end almost when I read that, because it's such a powerful piece of writing. And that must have been read also in those industrial towns which were full of unemployed and hungry children. Dickens wasn't only visiting the industrial towns, he also made a point in London of going to the ragged schools which were set up for street children, and he wanted to help raise money for them. And he wrote a marvellous description to his friend Miss Coutts of visiting a ragged school, and he suggested that rather than trying to give them elements of religious education, which he said they were in no position to understand, these were children who were in and out of prison, who probably had no parents, or if they did, they were neglectful parents, they knew nothing. And he said to teach them religion was really not the point. What they needed was a place to wash in the school. This is another marvellous bit of Dickens. Dickens saw at once that this is what was actually needed, somewhere to wash for those children. And he gives a splendid account of how he takes his hat off to the master of the school and all his beautiful shiny hair falls out. And one of the boys says, "Well, you can tell he's not a barber." And they all look at his shiny boots and they look at his smart clothes, and he obviously appeared a rather godlike figure to them, and he wasn't going to say to them that he had been really, really quite like them not so many years before. Well, he did these public good things, he did private good things. Whenever a friend of his died, which happened quite often, leaving children with no resource, Dickens would immediately raise money. An actor called Edward Elton was drowned. His wife was already dead. There were 7 children. Dickens at once formed a committee, raised thousands of pounds so that all those children would be given an education and a training so that they could live proper lives. And he remained in touch with them. Esther Elton, the eldest, went to a teacher training college and became a teacher. And he was in correspondence with her 20 years later, and they all wrote to him, and many, many years later, to thank him. It's pretty extraordinary, that, and he always did that when somebody died. Well, just a final tiny point about 1844. Who was in Manchester in 1844 at this point? Engels, preparing to write his Condition of the English Working Class, a very great book. Engels complained that in England only the writer Thomas Carlyle was interested in the condition of the working class. I can't help hoping that just possibly Engels might have cast his eye over A Christmas Carol at some point, though I think it's probably not very likely. But I think that puts that letter in context. I wish if you squeeze a letter by a writer, it can sort of lead you along many paths. And that's what I've tried to do there. So now I'm with great pleasure going to join in conversation with John. You've had enough of me standing up here. Thank you. I bring my water with me.
Dan, could I have my...
Yes, we must display the book, mustn't
Yes.
we? So pretty. Whatever is inside it, it does look nice, doesn't it?
I was going to start by asking you, Claire, about Dickens's attitude to your trade, really, biography, because you talked about the letters surviving so compendiously, but he would have liked to have seen them destroyed. Does it imply that beyond the authorised version, he rather dreaded biography?
Well, I think, like most writers, he had very mixed feelings about biography. He was offered some notes about Charlotte Bronte when she died, and he wrote very scathingly saying, "We don't want that sort of rubbish in our magazine," in Household Words, I mean, looking into intimacies of people's lives. No. But at just about the same time, or a little earlier actually, he had asked his friend John Forster, when Dickens was still in his 30s, so he was thinking ahead. He asked Forster to become his biographer. And it was a brilliant choice, of course, because they were 2 men who really loved each other. They met young. They both came from humble beginnings. Forster's father was a Newcastle butcher, and he went to a grammar school, so he was better educated than Dickens. But when they met in the 30s, they both were sort of determined to conquer literary London. And Forster saw that Dickens was a genius. He reviewed Pickwick Papers, and he particularly noticed when he got to the prison scenes in Pickwick Papers. He didn't know anything about Dickens's background or his father, but he saw that something in the writing got sort of somehow stronger and more interesting there. And Dickens saw that Forster could help him. And indeed, Forster became effectively his agent. He read his proofs with him. He gave him advice. He also reviewed him. He reviewed just about everything he wrote. He became the family friend. But he and Dickens had a really great love for each other. And letters from Dickens to Forster, Dickens actually says this friendship will be till death us do part. He actually uses the word of the marriage service in England. And he trusted Forster all his life. They had occasional quarrels, but nothing really serious. At the very end of Dickens's life, he was going round, though he was very ill, to read the next instalment of Edwin Drood to the Forsters. Forster was by then married. And he told Forster about the secrets of his childhood. He told Forster everything about his private life when it was very secret to the world. So he made a brilliant choice, and I think Forster's biography is one of the great there was many great biographies written in the 19th century, and Forster's is certainly one of them. When Dickens died, Forster said, "There is no more happiness for me. My happiness, I won't ever be happy again." That was the strength of his feeling. But I have a duty, and the duty was to write the biography.
And presumably, Dickens would have expected Forster, would he, to have made the right decisions about which of those secrets to keep and which to...
Yes. I mean, Forster was sometimes a bit too discreet, I think. For instance, he just mentions that Dickens was going to set up a home for homeless women, i.e. for young prostitutes, with Miss Coutts. And he says, I will say more of this later, but he never does. I think he decided, we can't really do that. And naturally, there's a lot not in Forster, because Forster couldn't possibly have written about the Turnans, because they were still alive, and the family, nobody in those days, nowadays people don't mind having an adulterer in the family, but in those days, for a long time afterwards, Dickens said no family would openly discuss such a thing. So he's not to be blamed, I think, Forster, for not saying.
But he did write a bit about Dickens's childhood, and Dickens seems to have, I mean, obviously,
Dickens gave him his written account.
So he wanted people to know about his childhood, didn't he?
Yes, he did.
I mean, writing the biography of him, I mean, it seems reading it to me that you found Dickens's childhood quite as kind of important and sort of vivid as we as the story that's been told before.
It's absolutely fascinating, yes. One of the things that struck me very much, he was called Charles after his maternal grandfather, Charles Barrow. Charles Barrow worked for the Navy Pay Office, where now in 1812, the Napoleonic Wars are going on, the Navy is the biggest employer in England. So his maternal grandfather and his uncles and his own father also worked in the Navy Pay Office. That's how he met his mother. But Charles Dickens never met his maternal grandfather, because just before he was born, he was found to have been embezzling. He had a high position. He'd been embezzling money from the office for years. And his explanation was that he had a very large family. He had a very large family. And he hoped he would be forgiven. He wasn't. He had to flee the country. And I always think that at the very beginning of Charles Dickens's life, there was this sort of secret that was never mentioned. You know, there was a grandfather who was not in England and was never mentioned, just didn't exist anymore. And I think that's an interesting beginning for the life of a novelist. And then you get another secret. When he was put to work in London in the blacking factory as a small boy, and it was a terrible shame and humiliation to him. When that was over, his parents, who had agreed to this happening, he tells us, never mentioned it again. It was another secret. Everybody knew it had happened. He knew, they knew, but it couldn't be discussed. I think for a novelist, the mind of a novelist, the imagination of a novelist, to have these secrets must have sort of formed the way he thought about human behavior and human life. And then when in the last 12 years of his life became a tissue of secrets and deceptions and things that couldn't be said, he was sort of in that territory again, very familiar territory. I find that rather fascinating.
Mm. And do you, I mean, it's quite difficult, I presume, presumably in a way, when you're writing a biography, it is an exercise of sympathy. There comes a stage when he becomes involved in secrets, as you say, where it must have been quite difficult. I mean, when his marriage starts breaking down, it is quite difficult to sustain that sympathy, isn't it?
Well, there are two things going on there. I mean, the secret's fine. The bad behaviour to Catherine, not. I think Dickens was not just a genius, greatest creator of characters since Shakespeare and so on, and all the things you said as a writer. I think he was also an intensely good man, and a man who wished to be good and who wished to do good, and indeed did much good, as well as being a wonderful writer. I think when he decided the marriage, he couldn't stay in the marriage, and he fell in love with Ellen Turner, he had a great public persona, a figure who seemed to represent the domestic virtues and the other virtues. And he sort of desperately wanted to appear to be in the right. I think many people do who go through crises of that sort, men especially perhaps. They want to sort of emerge as the one who's right. And so it made him behave really badly and write lying accounts of Catherine to Miss Coutts and say things about her being mad which were not true. But one sees it happen. And so it's peculiarly painful. I did find it. I say in my book, I sort of want to avert my eyes. And his daughter, Katie, his very intelligent daughter, Katie, who gave good accounts of all this, said, my father behaved like a madman. And he obviously did. But then we say, I mean, biographers are not there to tick people off and to say how bad they are. They have to try and understand. They have to try and be tolerant of their subjects, I think, because it's not interesting to rap them over the knuckles.
But even that sort of, as you say somewhere, you actually, there's a great sentence in your biography, he was determined to be in the right about everything, and which stated baldly sounds like a rather unsympathetic thing about a person. But actually, the funny thing is, I was thinking as I was reading that about his novels, and it's quite a double-sided thing in a way, isn't it? Because that's also that's part of the force of his writing, that he has, perhaps not always to contemporary tastes, or perhaps it's slightly embarrassing sometimes, but there's something rather wonderful about his determination to be right, as well as something potentially rather unlikable.
Yes, he could be a monster, like one of his own monsters, like Quilp or Squares, with this huge energy. I think his energy is one of the most extraordinary things about him, the fact that not just the walking 15, 20 miles a day, absolutely necessary to him. I think walking, he sort of thought, he imagined as he walked and produced these voices you've talked about, his books come through voices, don't they, which he's thought of. But if you think that he began his career by writing novels in tandem. I mean, he's halfway through Pickwick Papers, he started writing Oliver Twist. Each month, therefore, he had to produce 2 quite separate installments. I mean, it's bad enough to be writing a serial anyhow, but to be doing 2 completely different serials. When he'd finished Pickwick Papers, he started Nickleby. So then he had to write an installment of Twist and an installment of Nickleby. I don't know, maybe some of the writers here have done this. I cannot think of any writer I know of who was able to do that. Then, about 1850, had career going. He reached financial stability and success. Copperfield, after Dombey, he was secure. He started on a second career. He set up a magazine, a weekly magazine. He was the editor, he found the contributors, he wrote a lot of the contributions. So he was running 2 careers. He was continuing to write novels, and he was running a weekly magazine. And then, in 1858, he took up a third career as a performer, as a reader. So for the last 12 years of his life, he was writing great novels. He was running his weekly magazine, writing journalism, dealing with contributors, and he was stomping around doing these readings. He was a prodigy, wasn't he?
Yeah. I mean, what seems extraordinary is not just that he was like this, but in a way that he knew he was like this. One thing that when one reads a biography, which I, in a way, sort of wasn't conscious of before, was that I was conscious of him as this extraordinary dynamo, but he keeps saying, I am an extraordinary dynamo, sort of thing. There's a wonderful, there's a bit of a letter here you quote to Mary Boyle, and he says, constituted to do the work that is in me. I am a man full of passion and energy, and my own wild way that I must go is often at the best wild enough. I know he's not just talking about writing there, but you know, as I am constituted, he thinks of himself as this extraordinary person.
He uses that phrase about going his own wild way several times in his letters. It's obviously one he sort of found absolutely apt to describe himself. I mean, what one loves about him too, how when his old schoolmaster sent him a snuff box when he'd just written Pickwick, inscribed to the inimitable Boz, he then started calling himself the inimitable.
Yes.
And families say apologetically, well, it was a joke. But I say, I don't think it really was a joke, because he knew he could do things that no one else could do. He knew he was inimitable.
Yeah, and I mean, do you think he was? What do you think about? I mean, we didn't dwell on his marriage too much, but the secrecy that dominated the last part of his life. It's quite strikingly, reading the biography too, one becomes aware that amongst these male friends he had, lots of these male friends, contrary to what one sort of supposes about the 19th century, are lots of people living quite unconventional lives, sexually and maritally, and obviously kind of being able to do that without any, in the circles they moved, without any great opprobrium or losing their jobs or not being read if they were writers. And I almost started thinking, well, would Dickens have been? I mean, because of course there's the George Eliot story, isn't it? Her publisher was terrified that people would find out that she was living with a married man. But then people did find out, and they carried on buying her books. Would Dickens have been so? Was his image so tender, do you think?
I think it was to himself, yes. I mean, you're quite right. I mean, Wilkie Collins had 2 mistresses, Frith had 2 families, Cruikshank had 2 families. There was a great deal of that. But Dickens had a very special place by the time that happened. He really was so much the man who stood for the domestic virtues, for Happy Christmas, where everyone comes together, everyone forgives everyone. I mean, the contrast between what he says about Christmas and what actually happened in his late Christmases when his mother wasn't there and his wife wasn't there and no quarrels had been made up. It's quite painful. But I mean, perhaps had he lived on and come to Thuringia for 2 years, something else might have happened. It's true, but it obviously wasn't possible for him at that point.
And it must be very difficult. I mean, it's obviously quite difficult to bring alive what it was like for Catherine to be married to this man.
Well, I think she was simply squashed.
Yeah.
There was no space for her. I mean, when they were engaged, he had been in love with Mirabino and suffered terribly being jilted by her. And he wanted to get married. He wanted to put his life in order. And here was this nice pink-cheeked, docile girl with an interesting family from Edinburgh who father had known Walter Scott. And so they got engaged. And she threw a little tantrum, and he wrote her an absolutely chilling letter saying if she was going to go on like that, it was no good. There will be no second warning, he said to her in this love letter. And, and they got married, and she was pregnant in the first month, and she was pregnant most of the time afterwards. And Dickens was the inimitable. He decided everything, where they were to live, how they were to live, who they were to see, who their friends were. He was a man of obsessions. And the one thing, he wanted to have 3 children. He was very happy when he had Charlie and Mamie and Katie, and he didn't want any more, and then more and more babies came. The one good bit of their marriage, it's interesting, was when they went to America in 1842. Dickens wanted her to go with him. And amazingly, she was not pregnant. They were traveling 2,000 miles around America, and so he wasn't writing. He didn't have any of his men friends around, any of his male social life that he lived in London. And they got on extremely well. And he wrote letters saying, she's really an out-and-outer, and she doesn't complain, and she's absolutely terrific. And for that period, they really, it's rather sad that they seem to have a cheerful relationship, probably no sex, which who can know, but it is striking that she didn't.
Think that was...
Well, she didn't get, it's the one time in the marriage when she doesn't get pregnant, and she doesn't get pregnant again until after they're back in England.
So that they were only happy when they stopped having sex together.
Well, when they were able to be companionable, and they were neither of them anxious.
What you were saying about his friends, and obviously he was he was sort of a man's man. I mean, he loved male, clubbable,
Well,
male.
it was the way social life was. Yes, that's right. But it was the way social life was ordered in those days. Yes, they had their clubs and they went out together and they did all the things. They went on jaunts. Dickens was wonderfully convivial. What is it Trilling says? The mere record of his conviviality is exhausting.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful, wonderful love.
But it's almost in that American trip as though for the first time he's actually thrown back on the company of his wife.
Yes.
And discovers that, she's quite an interesting human.
I don't think he's not actually she wasn't a very interesting
No, she wasn't interesting.
She was sweet and dignified and docile, and I think physically having all those babies, And the terrible thing, one of the things I did find out was that they all went to wet nurses. So she had the babies, and then the babies went off to the wet nurse. When you think of Polly in Dombey, a wonderful account of a wet nurse, a most beautiful bit of writing that, of course.
Richards.
Yes, yeah. Richards, yes, Richard, yes. It's got to be Richards, and then you're sacked. And then Georgina, her much, much younger sister, becoming Dickens's little pet and, sort of being the lively person in the household. I think you can't help feeling sorry for Catherine. But it doesn't make her interesting either.
No. What about Dickens, the father? Because, of course, in the novels, one of the extraordinary things he brings alive is what it's like to be a child, what it's like to be a loved child, but also a neglected child. And it seems, if you read his novels, you would think that the relationship between a parent and their child was a kind of holy thing. I mean, what impression did you end up with of Dickens as the sort of head of the patriarch of this very large tribe?
I think before you look at him as a father, you have to think about him and his father, because that's one of the most interesting relationships in his life. He obviously adored his father when he was a little boy. And then when the 5 idyllic years in Kent ended, where he was sent to school and he was encouraged to sing and recite with his sister, put up on the table in the pub, and his father was really interested in him, took him on the yacht on the Medway and that sort of thing. Got to London, his father in trouble, and suddenly everything changes, and his father, there are creditors knocking on the door, his father can't cope, his father is in hopeless debt. And goes off to prison. And Dickens is heartbroken for his father. But he also feels a sort of resentment at the neglect he has had. And he gets 2 more years of schooling after, and then his father is again in debt, and he has to go off and become a clerk. Then, as soon as Dickens becomes successful, his father starts wanting money. And Dickens became to hate his father at that point, and he writes extraordinary letters about his damned father and what a devil he is, and how he's absolutely terrible and just expecting money from him, and he puts notices in the papers, and that goes on for quite a long time. And then there's another volte-face. When Dickens very briefly became a newspaper editor for about 3 weeks, he appointed his father to be in charge of the reporters on the paper. And suddenly, his father is a wonderful old man and adored in Fleet Street and does his job perfectly. Dickens leaves the paper, his father goes on working there. And there's no more trouble. And by the time his father comes to die, Dickens is there, his father has this terrible operation, weltering in blood, and Dickens stays with him till he dies, and then he puts his arms around his mother, and they weep bitterly together, and then Dickens walks the streets for 3 nights in his distress, and plans the funeral. And then years later he says to Forster, "My father was a better man than I ever even realized." And what he does with his father in the books is extraordinary, that in David Copperfield, his father is Mr. Micawber. He is therefore not responsible for all the bad things that happened to David Copperfield. That's Mr. Murdstone. So Mr. Micawber has his father's charming and ridiculous manner and speech, but is actually a wholly benevolent figure. And then years go by, and he writes Little Dorrit. And there is William Dorrit in the Marshalsea prison. And this is not at all such a tender portrait, because William Dorrit is not a very nice man. He behaves very badly to his daughter. But Little Dorrit who is not a realistic figure, but is a sort of emblematic figure. I think you can see her as, in a way, Dickens... The thing about little Dorrit is that she forgives her father everything. She loves him without reserve. She starves herself that he shall eat. She is perfect. And I feel maybe Dickens was, in a sense, recreating this situation with a child who behaved as he sort of perhaps felt for her father what he wished he had been able to feel for his father. I mean, it's complicated, but it's very interesting, I think. He never drew characters from life, I think, but he used them in those interesting ways.
And do you think that sort of distorted his own...
Yes, I'm sorry, I haven't answered your question about... Well, yes, the sons. I mean, he loved his daughters without reserve, and they were wonderful. His sons, even Charlie, the adored Charlie, whom when he was little, he says, he takes after me, he's going to be like me, and Miss Coutts insisted on sending him to Eton, and Dickens didn't really like him being at Eton, and took him away from Eton very quickly. Charlie just could not. Charlie had the lassitude, as Dickens said, of his mother, and all the sons, except one, had that lassitude, and Dickens couldn't understand why they hadn't got his energy, why they didn't want to make their way in the world. He couldn't see that if you're brought up in very comfortable circumstances and not very much is demanded of you, there's no very great motive for fighting your way in the world. And he was really miserable about his sons. He tried to get them jobs, he tried to make them do things. And he said that he felt he never was able to show them love. And then one, the penultimate son, Henry, brilliantly defied Dickens, who wanted him to go off to India or something, and said he wanted to go to university. And Dickens said, well, I'll talk to your headmaster, but I can't afford to send people to university unless I know they're going to do it. And the headmaster said, yes, he's a clever boy, and Henry did. And Dickens was absurdly proud of him. He was still at university when Dickens died. Of course, he went on to become Sir Henry Dickens and all that.
Henry Fielding Dickens.
Henry Fielding Dickens, absolutely.
I don't know if there's anybody here who's called their progeny Charles Dickens Schmidt or something, but it's a convention which we might bring alive again.
Yes, he never called any of them after his father, John. No. They all had Sidney Smith. I should
have called my daughter Jane Austen Mullan, shouldn't I?
Yes. Alfred Bulwer Lytton Dickens, yes. Alfred D'Orsay Tennyson Dickens. Walter Savage Landor Dickens. Yes, one after another. He wasn't a good father.
It's more than time probably now when I think have we got some travelling microphones or something in the audience?
I'm to get my microphone.
Aha, they've been gathered by if anybody here, they're coming. If anybody here would like to ask Claire anything or say anything in response to what she said. Or ask No. Please. There's a lady at the front here.
Do I need to stand up? No.
You don't need to, I think, if we can hear you. If you want to.
No. I mean, Dickens was so adored at his time, but, the way he treated his wife, why was there no criticism at all, or was there any criticism of the way he treated his wife? I mean, he was quite public in his treatment of her.
There was criticism in a circle. He fell out with a great many of his friends at that time. I mean, one of the things that struck me when I was writing the book was how absolute the change in his life was. I mean, there were loyal friends like Forster and others, but there were those who did take Catherine's side, but they were all discreet. They didn't blab. I mean, there were a few newspaper stories, but basically they kept quiet. But, Thackeray didn't countenance it. Mrs. Gaskell was very shocked by what he did. You find a lot of... Harriet Martineau wrote extremely sort of hostile account of his behaviour. But somehow he survived. And, still now, when I go to some places, there are people who hate me because I have written about Dickens in a way which they feel... I wrote an earlier book called The Invisible Woman, which was about his relationship with Turner. They feel that I'm sort of attacking a figure who should not be attacked. I didn't set out to attack him. And a very curious thing is that everybody knows that Dickens, how he behaved towards Catherine. So that is in the public record. So, but there are Dickensians in England for whom Dickens is a sort of an idol, a saint who must not.
There are still people, for instance. I mean, of course, one doesn't know for certain about these things, but there are still people for whom it's very important that Dickens's relationship with Nellie Ternan was unconsummated. There are some people who know a lot about Dickens.
Although Henry and Katie both said that there was a relationship and that there was a child who died, and they were Dickens's two most intelligent and long-lived children. So, I mean, I'm baffled by that.
Yes.
Actually, everybody, Dickens scholars did accept it. People like Philip Collins. I think Peter Ackroyd sort of introduced this theory that it was an unconsummated relationship, which I find baffling.
Yes.
Sorry, what about the public? I mean, if Dickens had lived today, I mean, Hello magazine would have had a field day. I mean,
absolutely.
Pulled him apart.
Well, it would have been fine, because today people don't mind about these things. In fact, they add glamour. You know, the stars are expected to behave like this, aren't they?
No, they would have said with his lovely wife Catherine, and then at a certain stage they would have said they're very great friends still. And then they would have said, with his wonderful new partner, Nellie. I mean, it was unproblematic.
Yes.
But I mean, at the time, I mean, the public, weren't they sort of bothered at all by his behaviour, or?
Well, evidently not, because when he went round, I mean, I'm sure, of course, there were some people who were, as I've already mentioned, but when he went round lecturing, he got adoring crowds, rightly, because he was a wonderful performer and he was a great reader, you know.
Claire, I'd like to ask you about your work as a biographer. You now are totally absorbed in Dickens, and we can profit from hearing you, spout stories like you've met the man. But you've done this before with other great writers, Jane Austen, Pepys. So your life must be it's like serial dating in a way, and a very intense contact with these people. Could you talk a bit about the intensity and the way that you need to shed these people as well?
Serial monogamy.
I was going to say serial monogamy. I once said in a talk, it is rather like being married, as one day you feel very keen on your subject and the next day you hate them. And my husband was sitting at the back of the audience, and I noticed people turning round, looking at his expression. Yeah. Well, I don't know. Yes, you immerse yourself in the subject, and it's absolutely extraordinary experience. And you never shed them. That is, I think that's the point. I feel I have this family I live with, because you go on finding out things about them, you go on being asked about them, other people write interesting things about them, but they have been so intensely a part of your life. I think writing about writers is more difficult. I mean, I wrote, in a way, Mary Wollstonecraft was a great thinker, and she was a writer, but her life, that was more historical and biography. And in a sense, I'd quite like to go back to that, to writing more historically. Pepys I found wonderful to write about, because the 17th century, the history of the 17th century is the most interesting century in English history. We got rid of the king, we got rid of the lords, we got rid of the bishops, we changed our society completely, and Pepys lived through all that. And then it all came back, of course, and that was interesting too. But I find the 19th century quite difficult, because I feel in some sense a grey blanket came over society. I mean, one of, Dickens and Thackeray and other writers complained that there were things they could not write about in England, whereas the French could. And it was they couldn't really write an account of what a young man's development was. I'm straying from your question. How do I do it? I don't know. I mean, I don't know how. I've been very lucky. I've been able to do what I wanted. I've been able to explore subjects that I really wanted to explore, and spend time with them and read. I mean, for Dickens, those 12 volumes of the letters, rereading all his books, rereading all his journalism, it was a marvellous thing to do. You talk about being paid to read. In a sense, you know, I'm lucky enough to be able to spend 5 years working at something that I find really interesting. There are moments of despair, and of course, but yeah, I do enjoy it.
Yes, please.
This is probably the most obvious question that you've been asked most, so I apologize in advance, but I haven't found an answer. For most biographers and scholars, the most important or significant piece of information about Dickens's life is his childhood. So why did you decide to leave out his childhood and start his biography with his adult life?
Well, I didn't leave out his childhood. I decided that biographies can be a little difficult at the beginning if you've got a list of ancestors and the well-known childhood facts. I wanted to take my reader by the hand and say, this is Dickens at the high point of his life as a man. I want to introduce you to this man. And 1840, and there's this... it seemed a very good bit. I thought very hard about this, changed my mind, went back and forth, and I thought to be able to sort of give a characterization, a lot of information about Dickens as a man was a good way to start the book. But then if you read on, you will find his childhood does appear in the book, and I do give a lot of space, not only to his childhood, but to his parents. Well, take courage. It's quite a short opening chapter. But
when you tackle a new subject, now I have a loud voice. I don't know. When you tackle a new subject, at which stage do you read previous biographies, if you do, apart from such an obvious case as Foster's life of Dickens?
well, before I wrote The Invisible Woman, I'd already bought my first edition of Forster, and it's practically fallen to bits now. I'm going to have it rebound. Over the years, I've been reading, like Antonio, I was so pleased when you said you started reading Dickens when you were 6, because I said to an interviewer recently, he said, when did you start? I said, oh, certainly by 7, I said. And then I thought afterwards, perhaps I've invented that, but I don't think I have. But my first book was not Pickwick, it was David Copperfield. And my mother, like your mother, was a great Dickens lover. So I was interested in Dickens very early on. I read biographies of Dickens. I mean, the books about Dickens are endless. I read criticism of Dickens. I mean, at Cambridge, I read Edmund Wilson, The Two Scrooges. I read Edgar Johnson. I read Unipope Hennessy. I read Gissing, wonderful book on Dickens. I mean, Chesterton, all those books. And I've reread them all. And then I read Peter Ackroyd's book when it came out. The terrible thing is, Michael Slater is a great friend of mine. He's a really wonderful man and a wonderful scholar. And I said to him, I can't read your book while I'm writing my book. And Michael was so sweet and nice and understood that. The fact is, you read whenever you can on subject you're interested in. And then you reread when you're actually writing your book, you do your rereading.
But it sounds like you don't sort of read kind of recent and contemporary, as it were, rival biographies as a sort of way of gauging your distance from what other people are saying. Just do.
I think you have to be a bit careful when you're actually writing, just at a certain point, to throw yourself into what you are committing yourself to. I don't say I didn't occasionally sneak a look at Ackroyd to see, what did he say about that? Oh, goodness, no. Or, wonderful, you know, oh gosh. Yes, I remember when I was working on Pepys, I had Arthur Bryant, and I do have moments sometimes you think, this is really good. Why on earth am I doing it? You always have to keep your spirits up writing a biography. There's always a reason for not writing a biography, quite apart from what people think of biography. I mean, there's always a reason for saying, oh, well, you know, no, don't do it. And so you have to sort of keep going.
Can Claire answer the question about the
Okay.
What would Dickens be writing now? Well, one answer to that is he was already writing then for today. His whole way of creating London, creating a world, and creating character seems to me it's really as relevant today as it was then. But there's another answer you could give. When Dickens was approaching the end of his life, he told a friend that if he had his life again, he would have liked to have spent it running a theatre. He would have liked to have had whole, complete charge of a theatre, organised everything, the casting set. And I suddenly thought Nicholas Heitner might move over from the National Theatre. And you can absolutely imagine Dickens running the National Theatre with tremendous energy. And
So.
Coming back to the other biographies, was there a definite element you found missing in the other biographies which made you write a new biography now containing the central element which you sort of found somehow lacking?
well, one of the things I wanted to do was to give John Forster his due. John Forster doesn't appear very much in the biographies. And it seems to me that he is the most important figure in Dickens's life, actually. He's absolutely there from the mid-1830s to the end. And what Dickens told him, is absolutely crucial. And the use he made of it is absolutely wonderful. And if you go, he advised Dickens. He advised him to kill off Little Nell. Huge success all over the world. He advised him to write David Copperfield in the first person. And there's something I've thought about that since I wrote the book. David Copperfield seems to be one of the great novels of the 19th century because for the first time a child's sensibility, a child's voice is given its due, is taken absolutely seriously. And it's the most extraordinary account of childhood. Now, I say it was the first, it wasn't, because Charlotte Bronte had published Jane Eyre just before. Dickens didn't read the Brontes. He didn't want to read the Brontes. But John Forster did, because he was a publisher's reader, and he read everything. And I do wonder, I don't know, this is just my speculation, but I do wonder whether, having read Jane Eyre, it didn't perhaps influence John Forster to make that recommendation to Dickens that he should write David Copperfield in the first person. And if that was so, it is rather marvellous. Those two great novels, which were read all over Europe. I mean, Tolstoy was influenced by them both. I like to see them, perhaps with John Forster joining them. He was always, I think, almost always right in his advice. I mean, he didn't like the Bulwer Lytton, Bulwer Lytton asked Dickens to change the end of Great Expectations. Forster preserved Dickens' original tragi-comic ending. That was one of the things I wanted to do. I wanted to make Forster really be seen for what I think he was in my biography.
I think, we've got time perhaps for one more. Thank you.
Hello, my question is precisely about Forster. You told us before that Forster promised to discuss Dickens's involvement in that project, the home for homeless women, but then he didn't deliver. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that idea, on his involvement, not only in that project, but how he could represent somehow, or to what extent he could represent that idea, that the topic of the fallen woman and how the male middle class idea could save that the prostitute, the idea of the fallen woman, how Dickens represents that Victorian topic. And I have a second question, if I may, which is about...
I'm already a bit confused by your first question.
You were?
Well, I said that Forster, I don't know why he didn't go on about it, but I suspect he decided that because of what some people knew about Dickens having separated from his wife, that to write about his involvement with a home for fallen women would perhaps not be desirable in his biography. I mean, I think he was just being cautious, but I just couldn't help noticing that he'd put out a little thing, because it was written in 3 volumes. He'd sort of said he was going. As to Dickens's representations of fallen women, that is extremely interesting, but a very large topic. Dickens knew, he even reports some of the conversation of those girls in the home. There's a very good book by Jenny Hartley called Dickens and the House of Fallen Women, which is not what it was called, the house it was. But Dickens had a problem, that his fallen women are all melodramatic stereotypes taken from the stage. I mean, Dickens, as you know, went to the theatre all the time, and they all sort of beat their breasts and say they're going to throw themselves in the river and say completely unrealistic things. Nancy, Martha and David Copperfield, Mrs. Edith Dombey. Well, she's not a fallen woman, but she's...
There's her cousin or something,
yeah,
isn't it?
Alice, yes.
She's a
Alice.
fallen woman, isn't
and
she?
Little Emily. I mean, I always wonder, when in Little Emily, in David Copperfield, when they're children playing on the beach, and little Emily runs out on a spar, and David Copperfield is made to say, at times I wondered whether it wouldn't have been better if she had fallen into the sea than what happened to her. Well, what happened to her was that she was seduced by a gentleman. This was a very favourite book of Dickens, which he certainly read with Nellie Ternan, and I always wonder what went on in their minds when they read that passage, that it would be better for little Emily to have fallen into the sea and drowned than to have had a love affair. There is some disjunction going on in Dickens's mind about that particular topic, I think, which betrays itself in his presentation. However, I don't want to criticise him too much, because you can easily open any of Dickens's novels and find a page somewhere which makes you sort of think, oh, he's not at his best here. But that doesn't matter, because each of those great novels, I mean, Bleak House, Little Dorrit, Our Mutual, those Condition of England novels, they're flawed, but they are nevertheless great, because they create this wonderful world. They are written in, for the most part, if you think of the beginning of Bleak House, fog and that description of London, and Miss Flight. I mean, Shakespeare was well known to Dickens. Dickens was sometimes a poet in his writing. Miss Flight, with her birds, madness, despair, this wonderful poetic imagination of Dickens. Mr. Vowles, the lawyer, like a snake who swallows his victims. You know, there's one treasure after another as you read, and it's very rich stuff.
Well, that's how we should end, isn't it? With a peroration. And thanks very much. And we'll have a little coffee break now. And just, I'm sure we all want to show how much we enjoyed listening to Claire.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks very much. How many times have I interviewed you?